Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 8, Opinions and Observations of Learned Writers on Freemasonry, from an exposition of the mysteries or religious dogmas and customs of the ancient Egyptians, Pythagoreans and Druids, also an inquiry into the origin, history and purport of Freemasonry, by John Fellows, AM. Chapter 6. Opinions and Observations of Learned Writers on Freemasonry, who are in full communion with the order. Most of those writers on Masonry who belong to the craft, either through ignorance or design, have mystified the subject in such a manner as to render it not only unintelligible, but absolutely forbidding. The opinions, therefore, of those of the order who have written with candour, and with a view of eliciting the truth so far as they deemed consistent with their obligations, are entitled to great consideration. Such are the writings from which the following extracts are made, or at least the passages selected generally bear that character. From The Spirit of Masonry by William Hutchinson, Carlisle, England, 1802. I am induced to believe the name of Mason has its derivation from a language in which it implies some strong indication or distinction of the nature of the society, and that it has no relation to architects. The titles of Masons and Masonry most probably were derived from the Greek language, as the Greek idiom is adopted by the Druids, as is shown in many instances in the course of this work. When they committed anything to writing, they used the Greek alphabet, and I am bold to assert the most perfect remains of the Druidical rites and ceremonies are preserved in the ceremonials of Masons that are to be found existing among mankind. My brethren may be able to trace them with greater exactness than I'm at liberty to explain to the public. The original names may probably be derived from or corrupted from Mysterion, Res Arcana, Mysteries and Mysties, Sacris Initiatus, Mysties, those initiated to sacred mysteries. The English word mason has a very simple origin. It comes from Macon, French. From mas, an old word which signifies house, thus a mason is a person who makes houses. The awkward connection which architecture is made to bear towards the mysteries involved in Freemasonry is easily accounted for on the supposition, which is undoubtedly a fact, that the Druids made use of the craft of Masonry merely as a cover to their mystic worship. There is no doubt that our ceremonies and mysteries were derived from the rites, ceremonies and institutions of the ancients, and some of them from the remotest ages. The ancient Masonic record, The Examination of a Freemason by Henry VI, says that Masons knew the way of gaining an understanding of Abrac. On this word, all commentators, which I have yet read on the subject of Masonry, have confessed themselves at a loss. Abrac, or Abracar, was a name which Basilides, a religious of the 2nd century, gave to God, who he said was the author of 365. The author of this superstition is said to have lived in the time of Adrian, and that it had its name after Abrasan or Abrasax, the denomination which Basilides gave to the deity. He called him the supreme god, and ascribed to him 7 subordinate powers or angels who presided over the heavens, and also, according to the number of the days in the year, he held that 365 virtues, powers or intelligences existed as the emanations of God. The value or numerical distinctions of the letters in the word, according to the ancient Greek numerals, made 365, which can be seen here. With antiquaries, abraxas is an antique gem or stone with the word abraxas engraven on it. There are a great many kinds of them, of various figures and sizes, mostly as old as the 3rd century. Persons professing the religious principles of Basilides wore this gem with great veneration as an amulet, from whose virtues and the protection of the deity to whom it was consecrated and with whose name it was inscribed, the wearer presumed he derived health, prosperity and safety. In the British Museum is a beryl stone, the form of an egg. The head is in cameo and reversed intaglio. The head is supposed to represent the image of the Creator under the denomination of Jupiter Ammon, the sun and moon on the reverse, the Osiris and Isis of the Egyptians, and were used hieroglyphically to represent the omnipotence, omnipresence and eternity of God. The star seems to be used as a point only, but is an emblem of prudence, the 3rd emanation of the Basilidian divine person. In church history, Abrax is noted as a mystical term expressing the supreme God, under whom the Basilidians supposed 365 dependent deities. It was the principle of the Gnostic hierarchy, whence sprang their multitudes of theons. From Abraxas proceeded their primogenial mind. From the primogenial mind, the logos or word. From the logos, the phronesis or prudence. From phronesis, Sophia and dynamis or wisdom and strength. From these two proceeded principalities, powers and angels. And from these other angels of the number of 365, who were supposed to have the government of so many celestial orbs committed to their care. The Gnostics were a sect of Christians having particular tenets of faith. They assumed their name to express that new knowledge and extraordinary light to which they made pretensions, the word Gnostic implying an enlightened person. Jupiter Ammon was worshipped under the symbol of the sun. He was painted with horns because with the astronomers the sign Aries in the zodiac is the beginning of the year. When the sun enters into the house of Aries, he commences his annual course. Heat in the Hebrew tongue is Hama, and in the prophet Isaiah, Humamine is given as a name of such images. The error of depicting him with horns grew from the doubtful signification of the Hebrew word, which at once expresses heat, splendor or brightness, and also horns. The sun was also worshipped by the house of Judah under the name of Tammuz. For Tammuz, saith Hiram, was Adonis, and Adonis is generally interpreted as the sun from the Hebrew word Adan, signifying dominion, the same as Baal or Moloch, formerly did the lord or prince of the planets. The month which we call June was by the Hebrews called Tammuz, and the entrance of the sun into the sign Cancer was in Jews' astronomy termed Telmakia Tammuz, the revolution of Tammuz. About the time of our Savior, the Jews held it unlawful to pronounce that essential name of God, Jehovah, and instead thereof read Adonai, to prevent the heathen blaspheming that holy name by the adoption of the name of Jove, etc., to the idols. Concerning Adonis, whom some ancient authors call Osiris, there are two things remarkable: the death or loss of Adonis, and the finding of him again. As there was great lamentation at his loss, so was there great joy at his finding. By the death or loss of Adonis, we are to understand the departure of the sun, by his finding again the return of that luminary. Now he seemeth to depart twice in the year, first when he is in the Tropic of Cancer, in the farthest degree northward, and secondly when he is in the Tropic of Capricorn, in the farthest degree southward. Hence we may note that the Egyptians celebrated their Adonia in the month of November, when the sun began to be farthest southward, and the house of Judah theirs in the month of June, when the sun was farthest northward. Yet both were for the same reasons. Some authors say that this lamentation was performed over an image in the night season, and when they had sufficiently lamented, a candle was brought into the room, which ceremony might mystically denote the return of the sun. Then the priest with a soft voice muttered this form of words: "Trust ye in God, for out of pain salvation is come unto us." Godwin's Moses and Aaron. Our ancient record, which I have mentioned, brings us positive evidence of the Pythagorean doctrine and Basilidian principles, making the foundation of our religious and moral rules. As the servants of one God, our predecessors professed the temple, wherein the deity approved to be served was not the work of men's hands. In this the Druids copied after them. The universe, they confessed, was filled with his presence, and he was not hidden from the most distant quarters of creation. They looked upwards to the heavens as his throne, and wheresoever under the sun they worshipped, they regarded themselves as being in the dwelling place of the divinity, from whose eye nothing was concealed. The ancients not only refrained from building temples, but even held it utterly unlawful, because they thought no temple spacious enough for the sun, the great symbol of the deity. Mundus universus est templum solis was their maxim. They thought it profane to set limits to the infinity of the deity. When in later ages they built temples, they left them open to the heavens and unroofed. The maxim of the ancients, that the whole world was the temple of the sun, does not indicate that they looked upon the sun as the symbol of the deity, but as the deity itself. As we derived many of our mysteries and moral principles from the doctrines of Pythagoras, who had acquired his learning in Egypt, and others from the Phoenicians, who had received the Egyptian theology in an early age, it is not to be wondered that we should adopt symbols to represent or express the attributes of the divinity. The third emanation of Abrax in the Gnostic hierarchy was phronesis, the emblem of prudence, which is the first and most exalted object that demands our attention in the lodge. It is placed in the center, ever to be present to the eye of the mason, that his heart may be attentive to her dictates and steadfast in her laws. For prudence is the rule of all virtues. Prudence is the path which leads to every degree of propriety. Prudence is the channel whence self-approbation flows forever. She leads us forth to worthy actions, and as a blazing star enlighteneth us through the dreary and darksome paths of this life. It is a difficult task for Masons to make out anything respecting this blazing star that has the least semblance of reason. They find it among the symbols, but are not aware how it came there, and endeavor to make the best of it they possibly can. The reader will recollect that it is Anubis, the dog star, who warned the Egyptians to retire from the plain with their produce to avoid the destructive effects of the inundation. That innocence should be the professed principle of a Mason occasions no astonishment when we consider that the discovery of the deity leads us to the knowledge of those maxims wherewith he may be well pleased. The very idea of a God is succeeded with the belief that he can approve of nothing that is evil. And when first our predecessors professed themselves servants of the architect of the world, as an indispensable duty, they professed innocence and put on white raiment as a type and characteristic of their conviction and of their being devoted to his will. The Druids were apparelled in white at the time of their sacrifices and solemn offices. The Egyptian priests of Osiris wore snow-white cotton in the service of Ceres Isis, under whom was symbolized the gift of providence in the fruits of the earth. And the Grecian priests also put on white. Every degree of sin strikes the rational mind of man with some feelings of self-condemnation. Under such conviction, who could call upon or claim the presence of a divinity whose demonstration is good works? Hence are men naturally led to conceive that such divinity will accept only works of righteousness. Standing forth for the approbation of heaven, the servants of the first revealed God bound themselves to maxims of purity and virtue. And as Masons, we regard the principles of those who were the first worshippers of the true God. We imitate their apparel and assume the badge of innocence. In this pretension of the author, that the predecessors of the Freemasons were the first to discover the true God, an allusion is evidently made to the Egyptians, who seem to have been great boasters in this respect. The most ancient of the profane historians, and he who speaks in the most learned manner of the religion of the Egyptians, is Herodotus. The Egyptians, according to him, are the first people in the world who knew the names of the 12 great gods, and from them the Greeks had learnt them. They too are the first who erected altars to the gods, made representations of them, raised temples to them, and had priests for their service, excluding wholly the other sects from the priesthood. Never was any people, continues he, more religious. They even had two sorts of writing, the one common and the other sacred, and this last is set apart solely for the mysteries of religion. Their priests shave their whole body every third day. Clothed in linen with sandals made of the plant papyrus, they are not allowed to wear other apparel, nor other covering for their feet. They are obliged to bathe themselves in cold water twice a day, and as often by night. So scrupulously exact must the priests be in the choice of the victims which they are to offer to their gods, that they are punished with death if they offer up any which have not the qualities requisite. The color of white, being made a symbol of purity and innocence, probably owes its origin to the following absurd notions of the ancients. As the constellations of summer accompanied the season of long, warm and clouded days, and that of fruits and harvests, they were considered as the powers of light, fecundity and creation. And by a transition from a physical to a moral sense, they became genii, angels of science, of beneficence, of purity and virtue. And as the constellations of winter were connected with long nights and polar fogs, they were the genii of darkness, of destruction, of death, and by transition, angels of ignorance, of wickedness, of sin and vice. Now, as the earthly states, the greater part despotic, had already their monarchs, and as the sun was apparently the monarch of the skies, the summer hemisphere, empire of light and its constellations, a people of white angels had for king an enlightened God, a creator intelligent and good. And as every rebel faction must have its chief, the heaven of winter, the subterraneous empire of darkness and woe and its stars, a people of black angels, giants or demons, had for their chief a malignant genius whose character was applied by different people to the constellation, which to them was the most remarkable. Ruins, pages 144 to 146. The priests, says Dupuy, clothed themselves in white, a color assigned to Ammon, or the god of light. The superstition, or rather affectation in regard to this color, is still retained among some Christian sects, whose priests cover themselves with this pagan outward show of purity. It is somewhat remarkable that white as an emblem of purity and innocence should have descended to the Aborigines of America. The prophet, who accompanied Black Hawk and other chiefs to Washington as hostages for the faithful performance of the treaty made with their nation, 1833, thus addressed the President of the United States. "Father, I have come this day clothed in white," pointing to his leather doublet, "in order to prove that my intentions are of the most pacific nature, and," raising his hands to heaven, "I call upon the Great Spirit of myself and forefathers to witness the purity of my heart on this occasion." In this country, England, under the Druids, the first principles of our profession most assuredly were taught and exercised. We are bold to say that if we trace the antiquity of Masonry on operative principles and derive such principles from the building of Solomon's Temple, we may as well claim all the professions which Hiram excelled in. Assuredly, the secrets revealed to us were for other uses than what relate to laboring up masses of stone, and our society, as it now stands, is an association on religious and charitable principles, which principles were instituted and arose upon the knowledge of God. We ground a judgment of the nature of our profession on our ceremonials and flatter ourselves every Mason will be convinced that they have no relation to building and architecture, but are emblematical and imply moral and spiritual and religious tenets. It appears self-evident that the situation of the lodge and its several parts are copied after the tabernacle and temple and are representative of the universe, implying that the universe is the temple in which the deity is everywhere present. This was a pagan principle according to the author's own showing above. The fact is, the tabernacle as well as the Temple of Solomon appears to have been constructed upon the same plan as the temples of the ancients. Our mode of teaching the principles of our profession is derived from the Druids, our maxims of morality from Pythagoras, our chief emblems originally from Egypt. To Basilides we owe the science of Abrax and the characters of those emanations of the deity which we have adopted and which are so necessary for the maintenance of a moral society. Our lodges are not now appropriated to worship and religious ceremonies. We meet as a social society inclined to acts of benevolence and suffer the more sacred offices to rest unperformed. Whether this neglect is to our honor, we presume not to determine. In our present state, professing ourselves free and accepted Masons, we are totally severed from architects and are become a set of men working in the duties of charity, good offices, and brotherly love. From the ancient rites and ceremonies which we have laid before you, it will be easy for you to trace the origin of our own rites and to discover the foundations on which our society is formed. We've explained to you that the structure of the lodge is a pattern of the universe and that the first entry of a Mason represents the first worship of the true God. We have retained the Egyptian symbols of the sun and moon as the emblems of God's power, eternity, omnipresence, and benevolence. And thereby we signify that we are the children of light, and that the first foundation of our profession is the knowledge and adoration of Almighty Mesumneo, who seateth himself in the center of the heavens. We derive from the Druids many of the Ammonian rites and have saved from oblivion many of their religious rites in our initiation to the first degree of Masonry, which otherwise would have slept in eternity. These we seem to have mixed and tempered with the principles of the Essenes, who are a sect as ancient as the departure of the children of Israel out of Egypt. The philosophy of the Egyptians and the manners, principles, and customs of the Hebrews were introduced to this land by the Phoenicians and make a part of our profession so far as they are adapted to the worship of nature's great author, unpolluted by idolatry. We hold our grand festival on the day of St. John, which is Midsummer Day, in which we celebrate that season when the sun is in its greatest altitude, and in the midst of its prolific powers, the great type of the omnipotence of the deity. We are not to search for our antiquity in the mythology of Greece or Rome. We advance into remoter ages. Religion was the original and constituent principle. A recognition of the deity first distinguished us from the rest of mankind. Our predecessors searched for the divine essence in the wonders displayed on the face of nature. They discovered supreme wisdom in the order of the universe. In the stellar system, they traced the power in the seasons and their changes, the bounty, and in animal life, the benevolence of God. Every argument brought with it conviction, and every object confirmation that all the wonders displayed to the eye of man were only to be produced by some superlative being and maintained by his superintendency. It was from such conviction that men began to class themselves in religious societies. I may venture to assert it was the only consequence which could ensue, whilst men were looking up to the divinity through his works, that they would conclude the sun was the region where in celestial glory the deity reposed. We discover in the Ammonian and Egyptian rites the most perfect remains of those originals to whom our society refers. We are told they esteemed the soul of man to be an emanation of the Supreme, and a spirit detached from the seraphic bands which filled the solar mansions and surrounded the throne of majesty. They looked up to this grand luminary as the native realm from whence they were sent on this earthly pilgrimage, and to which they should, in the end, return. The figure of the sun was at once a memorial of their divine origin, a badge of the religious faith they professed, and a monitor of those principles which should conduct and ensure their restoration. How soon or to what extreme superstition and bigotry debased this emblem is a research painful and unprofitable. We Masons have adopted three particular characteristics: secrecy, charity, and brotherly love. Our sense of these great duties has been explained, and of what especial import they are to Masons, or to men who have separated themselves from the rest of mankind, and profess they are servants of him who ruleth in the midst of heaven, if our ceremonies mean not the matter which has been expressed, if they imply not the moral and religious principles which we have endeavored to unveil. It may be asked of you Masons what they do imply, import, or indicate. Genius of Masonry, Samuel L. Knapp, ESQ, in a work entitled The Genius of Masonry, or A Defense of the Order, in taking notice of the late discoveries made by Champollion and others of the hidden wisdom of the Egyptians, by ascertaining a clue to the understanding of their hieroglyphics, observes, "These distinguished men who have embarked with so much of that zeal which is necessary for the accomplishment of any great object will, we trust, be permitted to entirely draw the veil of Isis, which has covered her mysteries so long that the world began to despair of ever seeing the glories it concealed. Behind this veil of Isis, I have long thought was concealed our Masonic birth. I now fully believe it. There was the cradle of Masonry, no matter by what name it was called, no matter by whom it was enjoyed." Page 99. An Ahiman reason. The Book of Constitution is usually denominated Ahiman Rezon, which is a corruption of three Hebrew words, Achiman Rezon, which signifies the thoughts or opinions of a true and faithful brother. By Brother Frederick Dalcho, M.D., Charleston, South Carolina, containing extracts from an oration delivered by him before the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, from which the following is taken. In the earlier stage of man, when the human mind, untainted by the vices and prejudices of later times, unshackled by the terrors and anathemas of contending sectaries and the machinations of bigoted priests, the God of nature received the homage of the world, and the worship of his adorable name constituted the principal employment of him to whom the mysteries of nature were first revealed. After the deluge, the worship of the Most High was obscured by clouds of imagery and defiled by idolatry. In many of the ancient nations of the East, their religious rites were enveloped by the priests in allegories, emblems, hieroglyphics, and mystic devices which none could understand but those of their own order. From these ancient examples, the mysteries of the craft have been wisely concealed from the vulgar, and under cover of various well-adapted symbols is conveyed to the enlightened Freemason a uniform and well-connected system of morality. I am of opinion that the ancient society of free and accepted Masons was never a body of architects, That is, they were not originally embodied for the purposes of building, but were associated for moral and religious purposes. It must be evident to every Freemason that the situation of the lodge and its several parts are copied after the tabernacle and temple, and represent the universe as the temple in which the deity is everywhere present. Our manner of teaching the principles of our mystic profession is derived from the Druids, who worshipped one supreme God, immense and infinite. Our maxima of morality from Pythagoreans, who taught the duties we owe to God as our creator and to man as our fellow creature. Many of our emblems are originally from Egypt. The science of Abrax and the characters of those emanations of the deity which we have adopted are derived from Basilides. The word Mason is derived from the Greek and literally means a member of a religious sect, or one who is professedly devoted to the worship of the deity. The author here adopts Hutchinson's conjecture upon trust, which has been shown to be erroneous. As humanity ever springs from true religion, every religious sect which acknowledges the Supreme Being is equally respected by the order. Religious disputes are banished from our societies as tending to sap the foundations of friendship and to undermine the basis of the best institutions. The great book of nature is revealed to our eyes, and the universal religion of her God is what we profess as Freemasons. Dr. Dalcho published a second edition of his Ahiman Raison with additions and explanatory notes in 1822. And it may not be improper to state that previously to this period he had taken clerical orders, which perhaps caused him to examine the Masonic institution more critically than he had done to ascertain if it contained anything inconsistent with his sacerdotal functions. At any rate, a change in his opinions on some points seems to have taken place, which are set forth in his explanatory notes, from which the following extracts are taken. Origin of Freemasonry. The principles of our order are coeval with the creation, founded upon the laws of nature and the commands of God. Nothing had precedence of them in time. The origin of the society, however, as an institution distinct from other associations, is involved in impenetrable obscurity. And notwithstanding the learning and zeal of many industrious Masons, it will, I fear, forever remain unknown. Various indeed have been the speculations on this subject, and great has been the labor expended by many good men and true to prove that every man of note from Adam down to the present day were Freemasons. But such round assertions are beneath the dignity of the order, and would not be urged by men of letters. Neither Adam, nor Noah, nor Nimrod, nor Moses, nor Joshua, nor David, nor Solomon, nor Hiram, nor St. John the Baptist, nor St. John the Evangelist belonged to the Masonic order, however congenial their principles may have been. It is unwise to assert more than we can prove and to argue against probability. Hypothesis in history is absurd. There is no record, sacred or profane, to induce us to believe that these holy and distinguished men were Freemasons, and our traditions do not go back to their days. To assert that they were Freemasons may make the vulgar stare, but will rather excite the contempt than the admiration of the wise. If St. John was a Freemason, then it is impossible that Solomon should have been one, because his lodges could not have been dedicated to St. John, who was not born until 1,000 years after the first temple was built. Therefore, there would have been in St. John's day what there was not in Solomon's, which would be contrary to our known principles. And besides, if both these personages were Freemasons, then we have the evidence that Solomon was the greater Mason of the two, and our lodges should be dedicated to him instead of St. John. But if Solomon was a Freemason, then there could not have been a Freemason in the world from the day of the creation down to the building of the temple, as must be evident to every master Mason. The excellence of our institution depends upon its usefulness and not its antiquity. It is sufficient for us to know that the origin of the institution is so remote that the date is lost in the lapse of ages, and can now only be indistinctly traced by occasional records and the traditions of the order. Dr. Priestley, in his remarks on Mr. Dupuy's Origin of All Religions, classes the Freemasons and Gypsies together. He affirms that they have formed themselves into a body, though of a very heterogeneous kind, but are not able to give any rational account of their origin. Institutes of Moses, page 336. The philosopher has certainly placed us in bad company by classing us with these vagrants, but his inference is nevertheless true. The purposes for which our institution was originally organized are now as unknown as the date of its origin. Whether it was designed for architectural purposes, for the improvement of the arts and sciences, or for the preservation of revealed religion by significant symbols and impressive rites, in an idolatrous and barbarous age cannot now be ascertained. Perhaps all these objects gave rise or perfection to the institution. When the Hindus claim for their Shastras an antiquity of more than 2 million years, when the Chaldeans boast of observations of the stars for more than 470,000 years, and Manetho Sebenita, the high priest of Heliopolis, claims for the Egyptians a national existence of near 64,000 years, who would hesitate to pronounce them all fabulous? Let Freemasons then give up the vain boastings which ignorance has foisted into the order and relinquish a fabulous antiquity rather than sacrifice common sense. Let us trace our principles to Adam, or even to God himself if reverence be spoken, but let us not excite the pity of the wise by calling Adam a Freemason. This will not lessen the dignity or importance of the institution, but rather add to its celebrity by giving it a reasonable origin. Mr. Clinch supposes Freemasonry was introduced into Europe by means of the Gypsies. See Anthologia Hibernica for April 1794, page 280. Although this is a very ridiculous supposition, it is highly probable that the leaders of the first emigrants of this tribe from Egypt had been initiated into the lesser mysteries, and perhaps copied in part from them the forms of the oath which they administer to their initiates. Every person who was not guilty of some public crime could obtain admission to the lesser mysteries. Those vagabonds called Egyptian priests in Greece and Italy required considerable sums for initiations, and the Gypsies practiced similar mummeries to obtain money. Depors Egypt, Volume 2, page 42. The customs of the latter, and the oath which they impose upon each other, has been preserved by Bailey, from which, as a curious antique, I make the following extract. The Gypsies derive their origin and name from the Egyptians, a people heretofore very famous for astronomy, natural magic, the art of divination, etc., and therefore are great pretenders to fortune-telling. It is the custom of these vagrants to swear all that are admitted into their fraternity by a form and articles annexed to it, administered by the principal maunder or roguish strowler, and which they generally observe inviolably. The manner of admitting a new member together with the said oath and articles are as follows. The name of the person is first demanded, and a nickname is then given him in its stead, by which he is ever after called, and in time his other name is quite forgotten. Then standing up in the middle of the fraternity, and directing his face to the Dimbar Damba, or prince of the gang, he swears in this manner, as is dictated to him by one of the most experienced. I, Crankcutin, do swear to be a true brother, and will in all things obey the commands of the great tawny prince, and keep his counsel, and not divulge the secrets of my brethren. I will never leave nor forsake this company, but observe and keep all the times of appointments, either by day or by night, in any place whatsoever. I will not teach anyone to cant, nor will I disclose aught of our mysteries to them, although they flog me to death. I will take my prince's part against all that shall oppose him, or any of us, according to the utmost of my ability. Nor will I suffer him or any belonging to us to be abused by any strange Abrams, rumors, hookers, etc., but will defend him or them as much as I can against all other outliers whatever. I will not conceal aught I win out of Libkins or from the Roofmans, but will preserve it for the use of the company. The centers have, it seems, a tradition that from the first 3 articles of this oath, the first founders of a certain boastful, worshipful fraternity, who pretend to derive their origin from the earliest times, borrowed of them both the hint and form of their establishment, and that their pretended derivation from the first Adam is a forgery, it being only from the first Adam Tyler. The same author has given the meaning of the cant terms here used as follows: Abrams, shabby beggars; rufflers, notorious rogues; hookers, petty thieves; Libkin, a house to lie in; Ruffmans, the woods or bushes; Adam Tyler, the comrade of a pickpocket who receives stolen goods or money and scars off with them. Festival of St. John the Evangelist. In every country where Freemasonry is encouraged, their anniversary festival is celebrated with great ceremony. It is a day set apart by the Brotherhood to worship the supreme architect of heaven and earth, to implore his blessings upon the great family of mankind, and to partake of the feast of brotherly affection. All who can spare a day from their necessary avocations should join in this celebration. The Freemasons of South Carolina have chosen St. John the Evangelist Day as their anniversary. The annual festival of the order is celebrated in some places on St. John the Baptist's Day, June 24th, and in others on St. John the Evangelist's Day, December 27th. The latter has been preferred in South Carolina on account of the heat of our climate, but why either of them should be chosen in preference to any other day is perhaps difficult to explain. I know of no connection between these eminent saints and servants of God and the Lodge of Freemasons. I now write as a minister of that God, to whose honor and glory my life is devoted, and to whom I must ere long give an account of my stewardship. I think I run no hazard of contradiction in saying that if either of these most holy men were now permitted to revisit the earth, they would greatly wonder at finding their names enrolled as patrons of an institution of which they had never heard. And there can be no question of the fact that if they were now to apply for admission into any of our lodges, they would be utterly incapable of working their way in. The annual Masonic festival in England is held on the anniversary of the feast of St. John the Baptist or of St. George, or on such other day as the Grand Master may appoint. Their reasons for selecting these days are sufficiently expressive of their opinions. The feast of St. John the Baptist occurs on the 24th of June, when in that climate the weather is not too warm for a public procession. And St. George, whose anniversary is held April 23rd, is the patron saint of England. This to me is clear evidence that the anniversary of St. John was not selected because they deem him to have been a Freemason. I am, however, of opinion that we act wisely in taking St. John the Evangelist for the patron of our order. He is worthy of imitation, both in his principles and conduct. But as it has been well said of old, amicus Plato, amicus Socrates, sed magis amica veritas, so I may truly say that I highly venerate the Masonic institution under the fullest persuasion that where its principles are acknowledged and its laws and precepts obeyed, it comes nearest to the Christian religion in its moral effects and influence than any institution with which I am acquainted. At the same time, I hold truth to be too sacredly connected with my office and character to allow me to approve of the custom now generally adopted, of dedicating our lodges to God and the Holy St. John as joint patrons of the society. I hold it to be irreverent to unite the name of any created being with the uncreated Godhead. The name of God is surely sufficiently honorable and powerful as the patron of our institution without the addition of any other. If the lodge be dedicated to God, let it be dedicated to him alone. He can bless all our work begun, continued, and ending in him without the assistance of St. John. But if it be necessary to have St. John, let us take him alone as our tutelary head, or unite with him any of the old worthies, usually considered as Masons. It is a well-known fact, as before observed, that the early Christians very judiciously adopted not only the festival days of the pagans, but even their manner of celebrating them. This was doubtless done with the view of rendering the change in the new religion less perceptible and consequently less shocking to the prejudices of those who adhered to the ancient institution. Among the principal festivals of the pagans were those of the solstices and equinoxes. De Paul, in his philosophical dissertations on the Egyptians and Chinese, observes that besides the Sabbath, which the Egyptians seem to have observed very regularly, they had a fixed festival at each new moon, one at the summer and one at the winter solstice, as well as the vernal and autumnal equinoxes. Others, except those at the rising of Sirius, were changeable and dependent on certain combinations known only to the priests, who transferred them arbitrarily whenever they occurred on the Neomenia, the equinox, or the solstice. Volume 2, page 159. The festival of the 25th of December, says Higgins in his Celtic Druids, page 165, was celebrated by the Druids in Britain and Ireland with great fires lighted on the tops of the hills. This festival was repeated on the 12th day, or on what we call the Epiphany. In some parts, the fires are still continued, The evergreens, and particularly the mistletoe, which are used all over the country and even in London, in this festival betray its druidical origin. On the 25th of December, at the first moment of the day throughout all the ancient world, the birthday of the god Sol was celebrated. This was the moment when, after the supposed winter solstice and the lowest point of his degradation below our hemisphere, he began to increase and gradually to ascend. At this moment, in all the ancient regions, his birthday was kept. From India to the Ultima Thule, these ceremonies partook of the same character. Everywhere the god was feigned to be born, and his festival was celebrated with great rejoicings. The fires on the hills are symbolical of the power and ardor of the sun, when he should have ascended to the upper regions, which he was then approaching. And the evergreens are typical of the effect that would be produced in the vegetable kingdom by that event. What possible allusion can the display of evergreens at Christmas have unless that here suggested? The custom is undoubtedly borrowed from the Druids and is continued without the least applicability to the Christian religion. Masonic lodges, moreover, are decorated in this manner on the 27th of December, which is corroborative of the opinion here advanced. The Roman and Episcopal churches still retain an astronomical caste, as is apparent both in their fixed and movable feasts. The principle of the movable feast is Easter, which governs the rest. Easter was an idol or goddess of the Saxons, in honor of whom sacrifices were offered about the time of the year which is now observed by the Church in commemoration of our Saviour's resurrection. It is kept on the first Sunday after the full moon, succeeding the vernal equinox. The birthdays of the two St. Johns, it appears, are fixed by the framers of the Church ritual at the periods of the solstices. These, of course, were observed as festival days by the Druidical Masons, and as they were celebrated openly with pompous processions, etc., it became necessary for them to use every precaution to prevent a discovery of the real cause of these demonstrations of joy. With this view, they appropriated the names of the feasts or festivals that had been assumed for them by the Catholic Church. But while they ostensibly honored the two St. Johns, they were mentally paying homage to their favorite divinity, the sun. Signs and symbols, illustrated and explained in a course of lectures on Freemasonry, by George Oliver, Vicar of Clee, etc., Grimsby, 1826. Under what denomination soever our science has been known in the world, under what form soever it may have been practiced, it has always been understood to have a distinct reference to the worship of God and the moral culture of man. The characteristic propensities of a people, the state of their progress from barbarism to civilization, their intellectual attainments, the character of their government or their intercourse with other nations might and did create some distinction in the ceremonial, but the great essentials broadly struck out by the Kabiric priests did never vary. In a word, the mysteries were the only vehicles of religion throughout the whole idolatrous world, and it is probable that the very name of religion might have been obliterated from amongst them, but for the support it received by the periodical celebrations, which preserved all the forms and ceremonies, rites and practices of divine worship, and the varieties of custom in this particular constituted the sole difference betwixt the masonry, shall I so call it, of different nations. Wheresoever the mysteries were introduced, they retained their primitive form, adapted to the customs and usages of the national religion, and if varied in some unimportant points, it was to commemorate certain extraordinary performances of the tutelary deities or to perpetuate some remarkable circumstance attending their first institution in a particular country. Hence the same or similar ceremonies which were applied to Osiris and Isis in Egypt, the great source of secret and mysterious rites, were celebrated in Greece in honor of Bacchus and Rhea. At Eleusis they were applied to Ceres and Proserpine, in Tyre and Cyprus to Adonis and Venus, in Persia to Mithras and Mithra, in India to Mahadeva and Sita, in Britain to Hu and Chiridwen, in Scandinavia to Odin and Freya, and in Mexico to Tlaloc and the Great Mother. For these appear to be but different names for the same deities, and most probably referred to Noah and the Ark. They were all originally the same system. They used as most significant emblems the theological ladder, the triple support of the universal lodge called by Masons wisdom, strength, and beauty, the point within a circle and Many other legitimate emblems of Masonry, they used the same form of government, the same system of secrecy, allegory, and symbolical instruction, all tending to the same point, the practice of moral virtue. None were admitted without previous probation and initiation. The candidates were bound by solemn oaths, united by invisible ties, taught by symbols, distinguished by signs and tokens, and impelled by a conscientious adherence to the rules of the order. They professed to practice the most rigid morality, justice towards men, and piety to the gods. If primitive Masonry was a system of light, the initiated heathen equally paid divine honors to the sun as the source of light by circumambulating in the course of that luminary during the ceremony of initiation. Did the initiated refer to the four elements? They were portrayed by certain prismatic colors. White represented the air, blue the water, purple the earth, and crimson the fire. The zodiac was considered as the great assembly of the 12 gods, the sun being supreme and the planets his attendants. The emblems which Masons now make use of as the secret repositories of their treasures of morality were adopted by the ancients in very early times as signs and symbols, and were even substituted for alphabetical characters. The triangle, now called a trowel, was an emblem of very extensive application, and was much revered by ancient nations as containing the greatest and most abstruse mysteries. It signified equally the deity, creation, and fire. On the name of the deity. The great name of the deity, which is termed by Josephus incommunicable, is said to be preserved in the system of Freemasonry. Calmet observes, "When we pronounce Jehovah, we follow the crowd, for we do not know distinctly the manner wherein this proper and incommunicable name of God should be pronounced, which is written with iod, high, vow, high, and comes from the verb haya, he has been. The ancients have expressed it differently. Sanchoniathon writes Javo, Diodorus the Sicilian, Macrobius, and Clemens Alexandrinus, St. Jerome and Origen pronounce Yao, etc. The Tetragrammaton was preserved and transmitted by the Essenes. It was always communicated in a whisper, and under such a disguised form, that while its component parts were universally known, the connected whole was an incommunicable mystery. They used in common with the whole Jewish nation the ancient and significant symbol by which this name was designated, viz. 3 jods, with the point camets placed underneath them, thus to express the equality of the 3 persons of which they believed the Godhead to be composed. This holy name they held in the utmost veneration. Calmet says they believe the name of God to include all things. He who pronounces it, say they, shakes heaven and earth and inspires the very angels with astonishment and terror. There is a sovereign authority in this name. It governs the world by its power. The letter Shin was adopted as a mysterious emblem to designate the Tetragrammaton, and hence this letter was supposed to comprehend many valuable qualities. It was therefore deeply engraven by the Jews on their phylacteries, both before and behind, to induce the protection of the omnipresent deity it represented. Another symbol was an equilateral triangle illuminated with a single jod. This initial letter, jod, denotes the thought, the idea of God. It is a ray of light, say the enraptured Kabbalists, which darts a luster too transcendent to be contemplated by mortal eye. It is a point at which thought pauses, and imagination itself grows giddy and confounded. Man, says Monsieur Basnage, citing the rabbis, may lawfully roll his thoughts from one end of heaven to the other, but they cannot approach that inaccessible light, that primitive existence contained in the letter Jod. The chief varieties of this sacred name amongst the inhabitants of different nations were Jah and Bel or Baal and On or Om. The first of these, as we have just seen, had many fluctuations. Jupiter, Jove, Evoi, etc. were but corruptions of Jah or Jehovah. Yao was pronounced by the oracle of Apollo to be the first and greatest of the deities. The compounds of the second name, Bel, are of great variety. Belus was used by the Chaldeans, and the deity known amongst the ancient Celtia by the name of Bel or Belinus, which title by the modern authors is identified with Apollo. The third variation was On. Under this appellation, the deity was worshipped by the Egyptians, and they professed to believe that he was eternal and the fountain of light and life, but according to their gross conceptions being necessarily visible, the sun was adored as his representative and was most probably the same as Osiris. They knew the general purport of the name and little more. If they believed On to be the living and eternal God, they allowed the same attributes to the Son, which they undoubtedly worshipped as the Lord of the creation. Oannes was the god of the Chaldeans, and Dagon of the Philistines, both of which are derivations of the same name. On was evidently the same deity as the Hebrew Jehovah, and was introduced amongst the Greeks by Plato, who acknowledges his eternity and incomprehensibility in these remarkable words, "Tell me of the God On, which is and never knew beginning." And the same name was used by the early Christians for the true God. For St. John in the Apocalypse, chapter 1, verse 4, has this expression, which is translated in our authorized version of the Scriptures by Him which is and which was and which is to come. The same word, with a small variation, was one of the names of the supreme deity in India, and a devout meditation on it was considered capable of conveying the highest degree of perfection. Seneca, the Stoic, says, "It is of little consequence by what name you call the first nature and the divine reason that presides over the universe and fills all the parts of it. He is still the same God. You may give him as many names as you please, provided you allow but one sole principle, everywhere present." In the ordinances of Menu, we are informed how this sacred word was produced. Brahma milked out, as it were, from the three Vedas, the letter A, the letter U, and the letter M, which form, by their coalition, the triliteral monosyllable, together with three mysterious words, Bur, Bhuva, Sva, or earth, sky, heaven. S.W. Jones, Works, Volume 3, page 93. These three letters, which are pronounced Om, refer to the deity in his triple capacity of creator, preserver, and destroyer. The method of using it is given in the same code. Three suppressions of breath, made according to the divine rule, accompanied with the triverbal phrase Bhurbhuvasva and the triliteral syllable may be considered as the highest devotion of a Brahmin. Mr. Colebrook informs us that a Brahmana, beginning and ending a lecture of the Veda, or the recital of any holy strain, must always pronounce to himself the syllable Om. For unless the syllable Om precede, his learning will slip away from him, and unless it follow, nothing will be retained, or that syllable being prefixed to the several names of worlds denotes that the seven worlds are manifestations of the power signified by that syllable. On the cherubim. Every branch of science is progressive. In the first degree of Masonry, we are taught the several duties of our station, whether to God, our neighbor, or ourselves, the practice of the theological and cardinal virtues, and every moral and social work. In the second degree, we are admitted to a participation in the mysteries of human science and catch a glimpse of celestial glory. But in the third degree, the veil is removed, we are admitted to the Holy of Holies, we view the cherubim in all their brightness and are blessed with a foretaste of heaven through the resurrection of the dead. And if we pass on to the royal arch, we receive a wonderful accession of knowledge and find everything made perfect. For this is the ne plus ultra of Masonry, and can never be exceeded by any human institution. In the peculiar lectures of Masonry, much importance is attached to that great symbol of the glory of God, the cherubim. It is a subject which adds much to the dignity and authority of our science, inasmuch as its illustration has formed an important part of speculative Masonry. When the true invisible God was renounced and forgotten, this symbol furnished mankind with plausible substitutes, and hence, in almost all the heathen nations of which we have any account, the Supreme Being was worshipped under the corporeal form of one or other of its component parts, and they all ultimately referred to the sun. And hence this luminary, in connection with the cherubic animals, became a chief object of Gentile worship throughout the world. The ox was adored in Egypt, India and Britain, China and Japan, Persia, Greece and Peru. As the ox was the predominating figure in the cherubim, so it was the most universal symbol of idolatry and was frequently worshipped in a compound form. He was an emblem of the Great Father or Noah, and the ark was called Kentauros, the stimulator of the bull. He was worshipped with splendid rites at that season of the year, particularly when the sun was in Taurus. In India, the bull was held in high veneration and honored with diurnal worship in conjunction with the linga or phallus as an emblem of justice and prolific power. A bull was also the well-known symbol of Bacchus, who is styled in the Orphic hymns, the deity with two horns having the head of a bull, hymn 29. The lion was adored in the East and the West by the Egyptians and the Mexicans as a most powerful divinity. The same animal was emblematical of the sun in Tartary and Persia, and hence, on the national banner of Persia, a lion was emblazoned with the sun rising from his back. The sovereigns of Persia have for many centuries preserved as the peculiar arms of their country the sign or figure of Saul in the constellation Leo. And this device, which exhibits a lion couchant and the sun rising at his back, has not only been sculptured upon their palaces and embroidered upon their banners, but has been converted into an order which, in the form of gold and silver medals, has been given to those who have distinguished themselves against the enemies of their country. The Egyptian astronomers taught that the creation of the world took place at the precise period of time when the sun rose in Leo, which sign was hence esteemed the peculiar habitation of the sun. And this belief gave an additional stimulus to the veneration which mankind entertained for the king of animals. Mr. Bryant observes in reference to this superstition, as the chief increase of the Nile was when the sun was passing through Leo, the Egyptians made the lion a type of an inundation. All effusions of water were specified by this characteristic, and from hence has been the custom of making the water which proceeds from cisterns and reservoirs, as well as spouts from the roofs of buildings, come through the mouth of a lion. The eagle was sacred to the sun in many countries, particularly in some parts of Egypt, Greece, and Persia. In our scriptures, the king of Babylon is termed an eagle. It was reputed to have fed Jupiter with nectar in the Cretan cave, and was certainly an emblem of his dominion. With the British Druids, it formed a symbol of their supreme god. It was embroidered on the consecrated standard of the Mexican princes. And the common ensign of the Roman legions was a golden eagle. Indeed, the peculiar property which this noble bird possesses of beholding with impunity the undiminished vigor of the sun's meridian rays would naturally procure for it an emblematical distinction. The man or idol in human shape was worshipped all over the world, for which custom this reason has been assigned by Porphyry when charged with worshipping God under the figure of a man. He allowed the deity to be invisible, but thought him well represented in that form. Not because he is like him in external shape, but because that which is divine is rational. The cherubim, according to the author, consist of the figures of a man, an ox, a lion, and an eagle, which combination he represents as awfully sacred and sublime, evidently with the view of heightening the mystical importance of royal arch masonry, whose armorial ensigns it composes. Dr. Rees remarks that cherub or cherubim in Hebrew is sometimes taken for a calf or an ox. In Syriac and Chaldee, the word cherub signifies to till or plough, which is the work of oxen. According to Grotius, the cherubim were figures resembling a calf. Bochart and Spencer think they were similar to an ox. The figure of the cherubim was not always uniform, since they are differently described in the shapes of men, eagles, oxen, lions, and a composition of all these figures put together. At the end of the planetary system, the Maestagogue presents us with a picture of the fixed heavens and the four celestial figures which were placed at the four corners of heaven according to the astrological scheme. These four figures were the lion, the bull, the man, Aquarius, and the eagle, which divide the whole zodiac into four parts of 3 signs each, in the points of the sphere called fixed and solid. The stars which correspond to these are called royal stars. After all the suggestions and conjectures of learned persons, it still remains to be determined what these emblematic figures were intended to represent. They form a part of the machinery of pagan worship, each figure being symbolical of the great object of adoration, the sun. This Mr. Oliver himself has fully shown. Thus it appears that the Masonic cherubim composing its arms consists of representations of the sun under various figures, conformable to the fanciful, superstitious notions of ancient nations. Ye inhabitants of India, in vain you cover yourselves with the veil of mystery. The hawk of your god Vishnu is but one of the 1,000 emblems of the sun in Egypt, and your incarnations of a god in the fish, the boar, the lion, the tortoise, and all his monstrous adventures are only the metamorphoses of the sun, who, passing through the signs of the 12 animals, was supposed to assume their figures and perform their astronomical functions. People of Japan, your bull which breaks the mundane egg is only the bull of the zodiac which in former times opened the seasons, the age of creation, the vernal equinox. It is the same bull Apis which Egypt adored and which your ancestors, Jewish rabbis, worshipped in the golden calf. This is still your bull, followers of Zoroaster, which sacrificed in the symbolical mysteries of Mithra, poured out his blood which fertilized the earth. Ruins, page 138. The supporters of the armorial ensigns of Royal Arch Masonry, according to Cross's chart, are two figures representing the god Pan, who may be considered as one of the most ancient divinities of paganism. Orpheus says that Pan signifies universal nature proceeding from the divine mind, of which the heaven, earth, sea, and the eternal fire are so many members. He was generally represented with the body and head of a man, and the lower parts were those of a goat, Bailey. On the mysterious darkness of the third degree, in the ancient mysteries, the apoptes, or perfectly initiated aspirants, were reputed to have attained a state of pure and ineffable light and pronounced safe under the protection of the celestial gods, while the unhappy multitude who had not undergone the purifying ceremonies were declared reprobate, said to wander in all the obscurity of darkness, to be deprived of the divine favor, and doomed to a perpetual residence in the infernal regions amidst a cheerless and overwhelming contamination. During the Persian initiations, this doctrine was enforced as cathedra from the desk or pulpit. The archimagus informed the candidate at the moment of illumination that the divine lights were displayed before him, and after explaining the nature and purport of the mysteries in general, he taught that the universe was governed by a good and evil power who were perpetually engaged in contest with each other, and as each in turn prevailed, the world was characterized by a corresponding succession of happiness and misery, that uninitiated and immoral men were votaries of the evil power and the virtuous initiated of the good, and that at the end of the world, each with his followers will go into a separate abode. The latter with Yazdan shall ascend by means of a ladder to a state of eternal light, where exists unalloyed happiness and the purest pleasures. The former, with Ahriman, shall be plunged into an abode of darkness, where they shall suffer an eternity of disquietude and misery, in a desolate place of punishment, situated on the shore of a stinking river, the waters of which are black as pitch and cold as ice. Here the souls of the uninitiated eternally float. Dark columns of smoke ascend from this stream, the inside of which is full of serpents, scorpions, and venomous reptiles. The multitude, being thus amused with fables and terrified with denunciations, were effectually involved in uncertainty and directed to paths where error only could be found, for every proceeding was mysterious and every mythological doctrine shrouded under a corresponding symbol. These allegorical fables becoming popular, the simple rites of primitive worship soon assumed a new and more imposing form, and religion was at length enveloped in a veil so thick and impervious as to render the interpretation of their symbolical imagery extremely difficult and uncertain. The slender thread of truth being intimately blended and confused with an incongruous mass of error. The elucidation was a task so complicated and forbidding that few had the courage to undertake it, and men were rather inclined to bow implicitly to popular tradition than be at the pains to reconcile truth with itself and separate with a nice and delicate hand the particles of genuine knowledge from the cumbrous web of allegory and superstition in which they were interwoven. It is an extraordinary fact that there is scarcely a single ceremony in Freemasonry, but we find its corresponding rite in one or other of the idolatrous mysteries. And the coincidence can only be accounted for by supposing that these mysteries were derived from Masonry. Yet however they might assimilate in ceremonial observances, an essential difference existed in the fundamental principles of the respective institutions. The author in the commencement of his work says, "One important question which appears to have been almost wholly neglected by Masonic writers is whether Freemasonry be a servile imitation of certain ceremonies in the ancient idolatrous mysteries, as is asserted by some writers, or whether it be the great original from which the mysteries themselves were derived. On this inquiry I have bestowed much deliberate consideration, for I found it impossible to be satisfied with practicing a science derived from the polluted dregs of idolatry. And he comes to the conclusion that Freemasonry is, in reality, the original institution from which all the mysteries were derived. And adds, we have ample testimony to establish the fact that the mysteries of all nations were originally the same and diversified only by the accidental circumstances of local situation and political economy. That an essential difference exists between the ancient mysteries and Freemasonry wants evidence. The whole of Bishop Warburton's dissertation on the subject of the former goes to disprove the assertion. However erroneous both may be in a theological point of view, they agree in moral principles and are unexceptionable. And that any institution called Freemasonry, or having a relation thereto, existed anterior to that which is termed the mysteries, is a gratuitous assumption, without a shadow of proof. The mysteries, under the name of Freemasonry, were first introduced in the 11th century of the Christian era. The reverend author, it is evident, instead of having any qualms of conscience on the subject, was endeavoring to satisfy the scruples which might arise in the minds of some of his less liberal parishioners. In all the ancient mysteries, before an aspirant could claim to participate in the higher secrets of the institution, he was placed within the pastor's, or bed, or coffin, or in other words, was subjected to a solitary confinement for a prescribed period of time that he might reflect seriously in seclusion and darkness on what he was about to undertake, and be reduced to a proper state of mind for the reception of great and important truths by a course of fasting and mortification. This was the symbolical death of the mysteries, and his deliverance from confinement was the act of regeneration, or being born again, or as it was also termed, being raised from the dead. Clement of Alexandria tells us that in the formulary used by one who had been initiated, he was taught to say, "I have descended into the bed chamber." The ceremony here alluded to was doubtless the same as the descent into Hades. And I am inclined to think that when the aspirant entered into the mystic cell, he was directed to lay himself down upon the bed, which shadowed out the tomb or coffin of the Great Father. This process was equivalent to his entering into the infernal ship, and while stretched upon the holy couch in imitation of his figurative deceased prototype, he was said to be wrapped in the deep sleep of death. His resurrection from the bed was his restoration to life, or his regeneration into a new world, and it was virtually the same as his return from Hades, or his emerging from the gloomy cavern, or his liberation from the womb of the ship goddess. This is exactly imitated in the third degree of Masonry, where the candidate personates his figurative deceased prototype, Hiram. Of this, Mr. Oliver is fully aware, yet with all this pitiful mummery before him, he, as we have seen above, says, "In the third degree the veil is removed, we are admitted to the Holy of Holies, we view the cherubim, the ox, the lion, etc., all in their brightness, and are blessed with a foretaste of heaven through the resurrection of the dead." Voltaire, in speaking of the Eleusinian mysteries, says, "This pure religion consisted in the acknowledgement of one supreme God, of his providence and of his justice. That which disfigured these mysteries was, if we can believe Tertullian, the ceremony of regeneration. It was necessary that the initiated should appear to be resuscitated. It was the symbol of the new life he was about to embrace. The Hierophant raised over him the sacred knife. They feign to strike him, and he also feigns to fall dead, after which he appears to be resuscitated. There is still among the Freemasons a remnant of this ancient ceremony. The whole of this nonsense grows out of the fabled death of the sun. It is he, the sun, that, under the name of Osiris, persecuted by Typhon and by the tyrants of the air, was put to death, shut up in a dark tomb, emblem of the hemisphere of winter, and afterwards, ascending from the inferior zone towards the zenith of heaven, arose again from the dead, triumphant over the giants and the angels of destruction. The candidate was made to undergo these changes in scenic representation and was placed under the pastos in perfect darkness, generally for the space of 3 days and nights. The time of this solitary confinement, however, varied in different nations. In Britain, 9 days and nights was the specified period. In Greece, 3 times 9 days, while in Persia it extended to 50 days and nights of darkness, want of rest and fasting. To explain the nature of these places of penance and mortification, I need not carry you to distant shores. The remains in our own country are both numerous and open to public inspection. For I have no doubt but the British cromlech was the identical vehicle of preparation for the Druidical mysteries. A celebrated piece of antiquity was recently standing near Maidstone called Kit's Cotty House. This was a dark chamber of probation, for Kit is no other than Ced or Ceridwen, the British Ceres, and Cotty or Chetty meant an ark or chest. Hence the compound word referred to the ark of the Diluvian god Noah, whose mysterious rites were celebrated in Britain, and Ceridwen was either the consort of Noah or the ark itself, symbolically the great mother of mankind. The phallus was the gross symbol under which Noah, or the great father of the mysteries, was worshipped, and it was usually represented by a pyramidal stone. Coincidences like these are too striking to be overlooked, particularly when we consider that the initiations formed a most important and essential part of religious worship, and no person could hold any dignified appointment as a priest or legislator without passing through these forms, which included, as an indispensable preliminary rite, the solitary confinement of the darkened pastos. On the 3 pillars, wisdom, strength, and beauty. In the British and other mysteries, these 3 pillars represented the great emblematical triad of deity. As with us, they refer to the 3 principal officers of the lodge. We shall find, however, that the symbolical meaning was the same in both. It is a fact that in Britain, the adytum or lodge was actually supported by 3 stones or pillars, which were supposed to convey a regenerating purity to the aspirant. After having endured the ceremony of initiation in all its accustomed formalities, the delivery from between them was termed a new birth. The corresponding pillars of the Hindu mythology were also known by the names of wisdom, strength, and beauty, and placed in the east, west, and south, crowned with 3 human heads. They jointly referred to the Creator, who was said to have planned the great work by his infinite wisdom, executed it by his strength, and to have adorned it with all its beauty and usefulness for the benefit of man. These united powers were not overlooked in the mysteries, for we find them represented in the solemn ceremony of initiation by the 3 presiding Brahmin or hierophants. The chief Brahmin sat in the east, high exalted on a brilliant throne, clad in a flowing robe of azure, thickly sparkled with golden stars, and bearing in his hand a magical rod, thus symbolizing Brahma, the creator of the world. His 2 compeers, clad in robes of equal magnificence, occupied corresponding situations of distinction. The representative of Vishnu, the setting sun, was placed on an exalted throne in the west, and he who personated Siva, the meridian sun, occupied a splendid throne in the south. The Masonic lodge, bounded only by the extreme points of the compass, the highest heavens and the lowest depths of the central abyss, is said to be supported by 3 pillars: wisdom, strength, and beauty. In like manner, the Persians, who termed their emblematic Mithraic cave or lodge the Empyrean, feigned it to be supported by 3 intelligences, or Mista, Mithra, and Mithras, who were usually denominated from certain characteristics, which they were supposed individually to possess: eternity, fecundity, and authority. Similar to this were the forms of the Egyptian deity, designated by the attributes of wisdom, power, and goodness, and the sovereign good, intellect, and energy of the Platonists, which were also regarded as the respective properties of the divine triad. It is remarkable that every mysterious system practiced on the habitable globe contained this triad of deity. The oracle in Damascus asserts that throughout the world a triad shines forth, which resolves itself into a monad, and the uniform symbol of this 3-fold deity was an equilateral triangle, the precise form occupied by our pillars of wisdom, strength, and beauty. In the mysteries of India, Brahma, Vishnu, Siva were considered as a triune god, distinguished by the significant appellation of Trimurti. The word murti, or form, is exactly synonymous with eidolon, and in a secondary sense means an image, but in its primary acceptation it denotes any shape or appearance assumed by a celestial being. Brahma was said to be the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva the judge or destroyer. In the east, as the pillar of wisdom, this deity was called Brahma. In the west, as the pillar of strength, Vishnu. And in the south, as the pillar of beauty, Shiva. And hence, in the Indian initiations, as we have just observed, the representative of Brahma was seated in the east, that of Vishnu in the west, and that of Shiva in the south. A very remarkable coincidence in the practice of ancient masonry. On the point within a circle, the tribes contiguous to Judea placed a jod in the center of a circle as a symbol of the deity surrounded by eternity, of which he was said to be the inscrutable author, the ornament, and support. The Samothracians had a great veneration for the circle, which they considered as consecrated by the universal presence of the deity, and hence rings are distributed to the initiated as amulets possessed of the power of averting danger. Rings are also presented to the initiated into the Masonic degree of Noachide. The Chinese used a symbol which bore a great resemblance to that which is the subject of this lecture. The circle was bounded north and south by two serpents, equivalent to the two perpendicular parallel lines of the Masonic symbol, and was emblematical of the universe, protected and supported equally by the power and wisdom of the Creator. The Hindus believed that the Supreme Being was correctly represented by a perfect sphere, without beginning and without end. The first settlers in Egypt transmitted to their posterity an exact copy of our point within a circle, expressed in emblematical language. The widely extended universe was represented as a circle of boundless light, in the center of which the deity was said to dwell, or in other words, the circle was symbolical of his eternity. The point within the circle afterwards became a universal emblem to denote the temple of the deity, and was referred to the planetary circle, in the center of which was fixed the sun as the universal God and Father of nature, for the whole circle of heaven was called God. Pythagoras esteemed them the central fire, the supernal mansion of Jove, and he called it Mesuraneo, because the most excellent body ought to have the most excellent place, that is, the center. And Servius tells us it was believed that the center of a temple was the peculiar residence of the deity, the exterior decorations being merely ornamental. Hence the astronomical character used to denote or represent the sun is a point within a circle, because that figure is the symbol of perfection. The most perfect metal, gold, is also designated in chemistry by the same character. With this reference, the point within a circle was an emblem of great importance amongst the British Druids. Their temples were circular, many of them with a single stone erected in the center. Their solemn processions were all arranged in the same form. Their weapons of war, the circular shield with a central boss, the spear with a hollow globe at its end, etc., all partaking of this general principle. And without a circle, it was thought impossible to obtain the favor of the gods. The rites of divination could not be securely and successfully performed unless the operator was protected within the consecrated periphery of a magical circle. The plant vervain was supposed to possess the virtue of preventing the effects of fascination if gathered ritually with an iron instrument at the rising of the dog star, accompanied with the essential ceremony of describing a circle on the turf, the circumference of which shall be equally distant from the plant before it be taken up. Specimens of British temples founded on the principle of a point within a circle are still in existence to demonstrate the truth of the theory. The body of the temple at Clasenis, in the island of Lewis, sacred to the sun and the elements, will illustrate the principle before us. This curious Celtic temple was constructed on geometrical and astronomical principles in the form of a cross and a circle. The circle consisted of 12 upright stones, in allusion to the solar year or the 12 signs of the zodiac. The east, west, and south are marked by 3 stones each, placed without the circle in direct lines, pointing to each of those quarters. And towards the north is a double row of twice 19 stones, forming 2 perpendicular parallel lines with a single elevated stone at the entrance. In the center of the circle stands, high exalted above the rest, the gigantic representative of the deity, to which the adoration of his worshippers was peculiarly directed. This extraordinary symbol was also used by the ancient inhabitants of Scandinavia, and had an undoubted reference to the Hall of Odin or the zodiac, which the Edda informs us contained 12 seats disposed in the form of a circle for the principal gods, besides an elevated throne in the center for Odin, as the representative of the Great Father. It is remarkable that in all the ancient systems of mythology, the Great Father, or the male generative principle, was uniformly symbolized by a point within a circle. This emblem was placed by the Scandinavian priests and poets on the central summit of a rainbow, which was fabled to be a bridge leading from earth to heaven. The emblem therefore represented Valhall, or the supernal palace of the chief celestial deity. It is said in the Edda that this bridge is all on fire, for the giants of the mountains would climb up to heaven by it if it were easy for anyone to walk over it. The palace thus elevated was no other than the celestial system, illuminated by a central sun, whose representative on earth was Thor, a god depicted by Verstegen with a crowned head placed in the center of 12 bright stars, expressive of the sun's annual course through the zodiacal signs. Circumambulation. The author, in conclusion of his course of lectures, among other remarks, observes, "It was an ancient custom to use circumambulation during the performance of religious ceremonies. In Greece, while the sacrifice was in the act of consuming, the priests and people walked in procession around the altar thrice, singing the sacred hymn, which was divided into 3 parts, the strophe, the antistrophe, and the apode. While the first part was chanted, they circumambulated in a direction from east to west, emblematic of the apparent motion of the heavenly bodies. At the commencement of the second part, they changed their course and proceeded from west to east, pointing out their real motion. And during the performance of the epode, they remained stationary around the altar, a symbol of the stability of the earth, waiting for some propitious omen which might announce the divine acceptance of the sacrifice." In Britain, the devotional exercises of the insular sanctuary were conducted on a similar principle. Ceremonial processions moved round it, regulated by the mystical numbers and observing the course of the sun, sometimes moving slowly and with solemn gravity, chanting the sacred hymn to Hu. At others, the devotees advanced with great rapidity, using impassioned gestures and saluting each other with secret signs. This was termed the mystical dance of the Druids. The circular movement was intended to symbolize the motion of the earth and to give an idea of God's immensity which fills the universe. The foundation stone of every magnificent edifice was usually laid in the northeast, which accounts in a rational manner for the general disposition of a newly initiated candidate. When enlightened but uninstructed, he is accounted to be in the most superficial part of masonry. This stone, to which some portion of secret influence was formerly attributed, is directed in Aleth's ritual to be solid, angular, of about a foot square, and laid in the northeast. It was incumbent on the author in the first place to account in a rational manner for the origin of the custom of laying the foundation stone of buildings in the northeast. As the whole machinery of the religion from which masonry is derived was founded on the movements of the heavenly bodies, there is doubtless an astronomical reason for this practice. Now, we are told by Mr. Bryant, quoted by our author, that the Egyptian astronomers taught that the creation of the world took place at the precise period of time when the sun rose in Leo. And admitting that this notion was got up when that constellation was situated in the northeast, at the rising of the sun, this circumstance would naturally, in accordance with the Egyptian mode of worship, induce the custom of commencing magnificent edifices at the northeast corner, in imitation of that glorious luminary, believed by the Egyptians to be the supreme architect of the world. This, among a superstitious people, would be deemed a certain means of ensuring their stability and usefulness. Mr. Oliver has bestowed great labor in his researches into the original meaning and intention of the ancient pagan symbols and shed much light upon the subject. But by endeavoring to place Freemasonry or something like it before the pagan mysteries, he has thrown a veil of darkness over the investigation, tending to bewilder his readers who have any wish to arrive at truth in this inquiry. By this course, he expects to clear Freemasonry from the imputation of having descended from what he considers a vitiated source, and on the contrary to show it to be derived from a pure institution, of which in his opinion the mysteries are a corruption. In this way he thinks to connect Christianity with ancient Masonry, and consequently show that he, as a minister of the gospel, may without impropriety ally himself to the order. There is no need of this fastidiousness. Ancient Masonry is a pure moral institution, but has no connection or relation whatever with Christianity. Its original dogmas are totally different, but these at present are not regarded nor even known to the craft, who perform the ceremonies for mere sociability and pastime. The secret discipline mentioned in ancient ecclesiastical history explained. A small but learned work bearing this title has lately been issued from the press in this city under a fictitious signature edited by Samuel L. Knapp, ESQ. This author adduces many authorities, in addition to those before cited in this volume, which go to prove that the fathers of the Church adopted the terms and ceremonies used in the ancient mysteries. The following are extracts from the work. St. Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria in 412, in his 7th book against Julian, declares, "These mysteries are so profound and so exalted that they can be comprehended by those only who are enlightened. I shall not therefore attempt to speak of what is most admirable in them, lest by discovering them to the uninitiated I should offend against the injunction not to give what is holy to the impure, nor to cast pearls before such as cannot estimate their worth." And elsewhere, "I should say much more if I were not afraid of being heard by those who are uninitiated, because men are apt to deride what they do not understand, and the ignorant, not being aware of the weakness of their minds, condemn what they ought most to venerate." Theodoret, Bishop of Cyzicus in Syria 420, in the first of his 3 dialogues that entitled The Immutable, introduces Orthodoxus, speaking thus, "Answer me, if you please, in mystical and obscure terms, for perhaps there are persons present who are not initiated in the mysteries." And in his preface to Ezekiel, tracing up the secret discipline to the commencement of the Christian era, says, "These mysteries are so august that we ought to keep them with the greatest caution." To show that these mysteries were retained under ecclesiastical sanction to a still later period, I refer to the seal of the ancient Abbey of Arbroath in Scotland, and to the explanation given of it by the Reverend Charles Cordinet in his description of the ruins of North Britain. The figures sculptured on the seal marked initiation evidently represent, says he, some formidable ceremony in a sacred place where a pontiff presides in state. One hand on his breast expressive of seriousness, the other stretched out at a right angle holding a rod and cross, the badge of high office, while he makes some awful appeal respecting a suppliant, who in a loose robe, blindfolded with seeming terror, kneels before the steps of an altar, while several attendants with drawn swords brandished them over his head. Mr. Cordinet intimates the resemblance of these figures to an engraving which made the frontispiece to a book about Freemasonry, and then adds that both bring to remembrance a description which Plutarch, in his famous essay De Osiris, gives of the engraving of a seal which the priests of Isis used in their solemnities, namely that of a man kneeling with his hands bound, a knife at his throat, etc. And, says he, it is not a little remarkable, which is more to the present purpose, in how many particulars the mysterious fate of Osiris, as recorded by the above celebrated author, corresponds with the account of Hiram, a strong insinuation that the annals of the latter, however mutilated and defaced, have somehow or other been descended from the Eleusinian mysteries, and that the Masonic rites of initiation into a lodge are a faint sketch, an imperfect epitome of the august ceremonies which took place at initiation into the secrets which hallowed the primeval fanes. And this high origin, when discerned, may have been at the bottom of that general respect which men of learning have avowed for them. This subject, as an amusing research into antiquity, may be resumed. It only remains at present to specify that Hiram, coming forth in hallowed dignity of character from within the veil of the sanctuary, violated in the open temple of the world by the ignorant and profane, concealed for a time in awful secrecy, the want of his presence pathetically deplored, the ardent solicitude with which he is sought for, the acclamation of joy at finding him again, and consequent discovery of the word, almost of itself, develops the secret which the personification had invoked. It does indeed develop the secret that the Hiram of Masonry is substituted for Osiris, one of the pagan gods of the mysteries. Mr. Cordinet understands what is meant by the lost word, which is declared in the Royal Arch degree to be recovered and proves to be the Logos, the second person of the ancient Trinity, the lost Son. The rod and cross, the badge of high office held by the pontiff, is precisely a copy of the measure of the Nile, which was originally put into the hands of a figure of Anubis to indicate the rise of the inundation, upon which mainly depended the subsistence or temporal salvation of Egypt. This pole or rod afterwards obtained, says Pluche, the name of Caduceus or Mercury's wand, and was borne as a scepter or staff of honor indicating a sacred person. The figure 10, a Kabbalistic number supposed, says Bailey, to conjoin the virtue of all numbers, marked upon this copy, shows its original to have been a measure. Mr. Oliver observes that the amount of the points contained in a Pythagorean circle is exactly 10, which is the consummation of all things. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.